Hi, welcome to this Simply Maya tutorial on batch rendering. Over the past few weeks we've had quite a lot of questions on our forum concerning batch rendering, so I'm just going to run you through the process here very quickly and hopefully it will be useful to some of you. So here in my scene it's just a very simple, quick turntable animation of what you might recognize as the creature from our creature featured tutorial, and what I want to do is render out 360 single frames. So I'm going to start off by going into my render settings and under the common tab, and you'll render out your batch render in whatever you have set up under your quality. So for mine it's custom. I'm using mental ray and final gather, which you can see here, mental ray, and if I go into indirect lighting I have final gather and global illumination. But this will work no matter what you have your setup based on. It doesn't really matter. So the first thing I want to point out is where your files will actually be saved. Now my initial file path is my documents under my projects Free Fridays, which is where I want it to go. If this is not where you want your images to go, you'll have to go up to Edit, change Project and Image Directory, and as you can see here you've got the settings to change where you want your default project to be located. But for our case this is fine. Now the next most important thing is Maya by default, when you choose to render, will of course render out one single image. Now this was just done to show you quickly, but if I hit render you'll see I'm not actually rendering out everything that's on the timeline. I am simply rendering out that one image, so I'll just cancel that so we don't have to wait. Okay, so in order to combat this, we want obviously all 360 frames rendered out. We have to change here frame name and extension to name.number.extension, or if your compositing program prefers it, name.extension.number. This is purely a personal choice. Some compositing programs prefer the name at the number at the end of the file, and some in the middle. I'm going to use this one, which After Effects recognizes just fine, and that's what I'm going to use to composite this together to make this into a movie when I'm finished. So as you'll see here now, we have some other things up here. It will now say file name number 1 to number 125. Now I want to actually add some frame padding to this, so as I know I'm doing 300 frames, I'm not going to go over 1,000, so if I put a frame pad of 3 in, you'll see here this has gone to 001 to 125. This just helps me keep the files in order, so when I'm sorting them with my file manager or when I'm importing them into something, they all line up nice and neatly. Okay, now you've picked your naming convention and your frame padding. You can see where your files are going to be stored, which again you can change up here. The next thing I want to just go quickly through is your start and end frame, because by default it's set us on start frame of 1, end frame of 125. I'm just going to turn that to 360, so it renders from frame 1 to 360 by frames 1 at a time. And this would be if I'd want to change the frame numbers from frame 1 to say frame 100 to 460. This can be useful if you're doing your batch renders in piecemeal, so you want to render out 100 frames and then you want to start again at frame 101, but you don't want Maya to name the first 100 frames 1 to 100 and then the second 100 frames 1 to 100. You'll need to renumber your frames. Okay, so now you've got your basics set up. You know how many frames you're rendering, you know what your frames are called, the image format you're going to use. This is again down to personal choice. I'm going to use Maya if for this. I also use SGI because it's lossless. TIFF if you just want a really quick, not to take up too much hard drive space, you can of course use a lossy format like a JPEG, but again in my case I'm going to use if. It's a smallish file size, it's lossless and it's Maya's native, so I'm going to use that. Don't need to renumber my frames. Renderable Camera is quite important because as you can see in our viewport here, I'm actually on the turntable camera, which will actually flip this round because the camera is moving. If I was on the perspective camera, 360 frames of exactly the same thing, which is not what you want. So if this is set to perspective, when I do my batch render, you will get 360 frames of the same thing. So make sure to check that you're on the right camera. Down here you have, as with any Maya render, you have your width and height, your standard settings. I'm doing a preview render, so I don't particularly need large resolution, so I'm going to keep this at 640 by 480. And that's basically the very basics of setting up a batch render. Your framing, your image format, where you want it to be saved. So I'll just close that down now. I'm going to make sure my menu set is on rendering, and before I do the batch render, I'm going to make sure to save the Maya file. Now, you don't always need to do this, but in later versions of Maya it does sometimes have a problem. If you don't save your file before you hit batch render, it can give you some strange results. So all we do now is, again, make sure you're on rendering, go up to render and hit batch render. If you just take a look at the options, you've got some options for memory limiting here. Useful if you have large textures, but nothing we'll go into at the moment. Just leave it on auto is fine, and you can batch render and close Maya, batch render, or just render, batch render. Now as soon as you start, you'll see here your result, rendering with mental ray. And I think each of these frames at the moment takes about 23-24 seconds. It'll take it a minute or two to set up the batch render. So I'm going to pause now and join you in a second after it's done a few frames. You can see it's starting the first one here. So I'll pause. When it's done a few frames, we'll take a look at what we've got. Okay, it's now generated a couple of frames. So if I click here to open our script editor, we can actually see what's going on. % rendering of frame here. You can see it generating new frames. So we're now on frame 3. You can use this window to see if anything has gone wrong. And if I open up my Windows Explorer for my project directory, you can see our actual if files being generated here. If I click on one, you'll see it open Maya's fcheck. And there we go. I can use this to skip forward and preview my animation. As I've only generated 3 frames at the moment, this is not going to do us a world of good. But there's your basic batch rendering in Maya. Your frames will be here, which is the directory that you told Maya to put them in. You can now use your favorite video editing program to put these frames together, and you'll have done your first batch render in Maya. Hope this has been helpful, and I'll see you in the next Free Friday tutorial.